Halloween, bitches.
For those who followed this channel back before the James and T podcast even started, you'll all know that my interest in music still featured fairly prominently on here. I did some countdowns, some worst to best videos, some lists, etc, etc. One of my first videos in the realm of music on this channel was on one of my favorite working musicians, gothic folk and industrial musician Chelsea Wolfe. In the years since, Chelsea's dropped some more work, my thoughts on some of her records have changed a little bit, and most importantly of all, Chelsea is now the frontwoman of a new supergroup that includes one of my other favorite metal bands, Converge. Before we cover that on the podcast, I'm going to do a more up-to-date video on Chelsea's work as a whole in the hopes that people maybe a little bit more unfamiliar with her might check her out, and because now I feel like I'm better equipped to do her justice. I've actually already made a tier list about the Converge discography, so, you know, check that out if you haven't already. If you want my thoughts on them, just a heads up, unlike last time, I'm not going to be including Chelsea's technically debut record, Mistake in Parting, as she herself does not consider that album to be part of her own artistic canon, and I think made it mostly for the label she was signed to. But I am still going to be including her Unknown Rooms acoustic compilations, because I still view that as an essential part of her career, despite not being a canonical album for her, technically speaking. However, without further ado, now, to preface all of this, I have to say right off the bat that not only does Chelsea not have a bad record, she's kind of one of the few working artists today that I feel is almost incapable of making something that I would deem bad. So, even at the very bottom of this list, there is plenty to love. The Grime and the Glow, released in 2010, around 4 years after she released Mistake in Parting, is what I think most people, including Chelsea herself, of course, consider to be her true debut. What we have here is a collection of oppressive, dynamic, lo-fi, gothic folk rock songs that soak the listener in Chelsea's brand of dark atmosphere. While these songs are somewhat crudely recorded, I think of this aspect as being more of a feature than a bug. The occasional swells of white noise, the vocals that sound as though they're reverberating along the edges of a vast chasm, and the positively gnarly instrumentals here are what give the album so much identity and character, to the point where I think that if you cleaned all of this up, it would kind of lose a certain edge to it. Songs like The Wise feature absolutely serrating guitars that feel sharp and wiry enough to cut you. It's not all fire and brimstone though, as there are plenty moments like Gene Wilder or Serenum Scopuli where we see Chelsea tone things down and deliver somewhat sludgy dirges with her knack for poetic and abyssal lyricism. When I call a record like this a novelty, I do so with affection, as I think it's an ideal record for artists like Chelsea to have, because it serves as a mission statement for their entire careers and becomes valuable once you've explored the rest of their work. The missing bells and whistles that you would find on later projects of hers might be a turnoff, but for me, it succeeds in both charm and having very solid fundamentals. It's not a bad place to start if you're getting into her, but you should do so knowing that this one is on the rougher side, and that while the DNA of everything she's made since can be traced back to here, her sheer variety and aesthetic leads to sounds that are miles away from what you're going to find on the Grime and the Glow. It certainly is far from perfect, as I don't think its thematic content or writing is as unified or even really as evocative as it would be later, but this is an album where I can excuse the growing pains. If someone called this her best, I obviously wouldn't be able to get on board with it, but if you're inclined towards a rootsier, more folk-oriented sound, this may just be the one for you. I'm glad that this exists, mainly because Chelsea's artistic oeuvre is well suited to something this raw. Even if I return to this a little bit less often than some of her other projects, I still think that the Grime and the Glow is worthy of a little bit more praise than it gets typically. Now, I'll be a little bit more short and to the point with this one, mainly because the full title sort of implies that this isn't really an album in the traditional sense. It is, in fact, a collection of acoustic songs. While Unknown Rooms kind of lacks the unification of her proper records, it really makes up for it in pure fundamentals. This is another album that, like The Grime and the Glow, isn't really a bad choice to start with when getting into her, even if it doesn't prepare you for her more musically adventurous detours later down the line. You can tell that the work on her sophomore album, Apocalypsis, really upped the ante when it came to her songwriting and general song construction, as the songs here feel a little bit more like they have more refined and distinct voices behind them. It contains career highlights like the song and opener, Flatlands. She's able to harness an almost otherworldly power with just her voice and acoustic guitar, and some light string embellishments. Like The Grime and the Glow, this album is a little bit better in the context of her career as a whole. But I feel like the strong fundamentals that were there are even stronger here because of experience, which makes for a more accessible product overall. If you're already a fan of hers and haven't sought this out, then you really need to fix that. Don't let its placement here fool you. This is a fantastic catalog of songs, just know that it's obviously very limited and gives you even less of an idea as to where Chelsea would go beyond her early ventures into gothic folk. Alright, this is currently her most recent full-length project, which dropped in 2019. While she's far from unheard of in wider spheres of alternative music, she's still kind of an artist who has a pretty niche fan base. Thankfully, she's a critical darling, and a lot of her acclaim gets her the exposure she rightfully deserves. However, on Birth of Violence, reception was a bit more lukewarm. While by no means poorly received, this album tends to have evaporated somewhat in a way her other work hasn't, as both fans and critics seem to have only vaguely have positive feelings towards it. In my opinion, it's a bit undeserving, but I would be lying if I said I didn't know why. As I alluded to earlier, I more or less love all of her albums, this one very much included, but what holds it back is that it feels like the first album of hers to be more of a sidestep than a step forward. Her 2010s run of records is truly astonishing. Irrespective of quality, she plays with tons of different styles and genres, and does so with very diverse and exciting results. Birth of Violence isn't quite what I'd call a regression, personally. I'd label it as being more of a refinement. This album is her return to more traditional folk and gothic Americana music, a sound that was found primarily on the two albums that I just discussed. Unlike those two albums, though, there's a bit more commitment to her sound this time around, which is both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, she's able to take what she did with her earlier work and give it more of a fully formed aesthetic. There's unity to the music, both sonically and thematically, that just wasn't found on more scattershot work like Unknown Rooms, and her lack of raw experimentation that we saw in The Grime and the Glow makes for a more consistent effort as well. She's able to take what she's learned in other contexts and apply it here, which results in Birth of Violence being the folk album of hers that I gravitate towards the most. On the other hand, there is a homogeneity that I can see being off-putting to some. Grime and the Glow is varied and off the wall, and Unknown Rooms is more of a collection than an album proper, so they can get away with the slight inconsistency by merit of their construction being different. All of that is to say, if this side of her work doesn't do it for you, this will not change your mind. I can easily see this record being a great entry point to her music, because it is handily her most accessible sound. It reminds me a lot of the ghostly, alt-Americana side project of Devin Townsend, Casualties of Cool, where it feels like a haunted spirit wrote and performed these songs. Lyrically, it's also just as strong as the rest of her work, and I find the album itself to be very enveloping. It's a proper journey through the wasteland of America, with Chelsea as a Greek chorus of sorts to narrate your travels. These songs do tend to bleed together, but I mean that in more of a complementary, more holistic sense, and that the album as a whole feels like it's an ever-evolving piece. It's a record that certainly doesn't hit with the immediacy of her absolute best stuff, but one I enjoy nonetheless for its dedication to perfecting the music that she started out making, and I'd even go as far as to say that I consider it underrated. Pain is Beauty is the first album of Chelsea's that I actually ever heard, and I won't lie, at first it was a bit of a difficult beast to tackle. I loved songs like Feral Love, The Waves Have Come, and what I still consider to be her best song, album closer Lone, but there was something about it that felt slightly impenetrable. It took some time to properly figure this one out, but once I did, I think it proved to be the most rewarding record in her catalog. However, I still completely understand and even kind of sympathize with my younger self's initial reaction to it. In terms of departures from one sound to another on like an album-by-album basis, this is the biggest change in direction in her entire discography. Coming right off the back of Apocalypsis and Unknown Rooms, Pain is Beauty is far more experimental and takes a lot more risks, heavily incorporating an overt electronic element into her sound that adds an edge to her music that was previously kind of untapped. The sour synths on songs like Kings create a sickly, almost lethargic atmosphere that feels distinctly off-putting in the best of ways. Often the incorporation of wider and deeper sound palettes are tasteful and allow for Chelsea to explore new and unique sounds that proved vital in the records that came after this. In many ways, Pain is Beauty is the most important album in her discography, because it paved the way for everything that came after it. Songs like Rains, Sick, We Hit a Wall are some of her most well-rounded and dark tracks, and the aforementioned The Waves Have Come and Lone make for the strongest 1-2 punch in her entire career. That said, as great as I find everything here, the experimentation does not always yield perfect results. Often these electronic elements can sound slightly stiff or out of place, notably on songs like The Warden, where the stiff drums and synth work feel a bit stilted and awkward. Occasionally, songs will kind of gestate in this semi-awkward place for a minute or two until they evolve and build into something a bit more layered and compelling. But it means that the middle of this album has a few songs that don't really fully realize their potential until they're kind of over, which means that you gotta settle into this album's unusual and occasionally kind of awkward sound and groove. Thankfully, what anchors the slight inconsistency is, of course, Chelsea herself, whose lyricism and performances remain as committed and haunting as ever, leading this experience to play and feel like a late-era Nick Cave record, both in tone and kind of the approach to the sound. In fact, if you're a fan of albums like Push the Sky Away or Skeleton Tree, I can see you getting along with this album a whole lot. It's a little bit less consistent than her previous affairs, but it was a vital and necessary step for her as an artist that yields far more home runs than it does misses. Maybe don't start here, since the sound itself may rub you the wrong way, and acclimating yourself to her through albums like Apocalypsis or Abyss might allow for a little bit more comfort in your listening experience. Speaking of, when I think of the quintessential Chelsea Wolfe album, I think of Abyss. Now, not to demean Pain is Beauty or anything, as that album, for all of its faults, I really do love a lot, but it's kind of a record that walked so an album like Abyss can run. 2 years between Pain is Beauty and Abyss were clearly spent mastering the art of synthesizing all of the elements of Chelsea's sound into one bleak, heavy, monstrous record. You can feel the elements of genres that Chelsea had never even attempted to get into before, notably that of metal. This album owes as much to Nick Cave or PJ Harvey as it does to Black Sabbath or Nine Inch Nails, from the overpowering brutality of the mountainous opener Carrion Flowers, which uses guitars that are revved up as though they're engines, and electronic synths and drums that are so titanic they feel as though they're going to flatten you, and they convey this overwhelming destruction that's found at the heart of every single song here. And then there's the intimate, heartrending, slower moments like Simple Death. And all of this is to say, it displays the variety of something like Pain is Beauty, but with the consistent execution of Apocalypsis or even Birth of Violence. There isn't an ounce of homogeneity to be found here, be it in the pure Sabbath worship of Iron Moon and Dragged Out, or the sheer lyrical brutality of something like Law or Grey Days. This is Chelsea at her most potent. Everything here is wound tighter than a Swiss watch, and in the context of her career, really does feel like an arrival of Chelsea as a force to be reckoned with. The only reason I might not choose to begin here is because you could very well end up spoiling yourself and being underwhelmed by the rest of her career, as varied as it may be. As is, this is not just a fantastic record, but this, in my opinion, is the Chelsea Wolfe album. At the core of all her interests as an artist and as a musician lies the dense and razor-sharp Abyss. And frankly, there's so little to complain about, I can't even summon a hypothetical broad issue that I even have with it. If my ecstatic praise for Abyss should key you into anything, it should be that this list is a testament to the excellent body of work that she has that such a great record barely even cracks the top 3. For those who tuned in to my video years ago, you might remember Apocalypsis as the album I put at the #1 spot. Granted, I do not love Apocalypsis any less. Not only is it one of Chelsea's best, but it ranks in the high pantheons of my favorite albums ever. The line between this and the number one is pretty thin, and while the quality of both is nigh unparalleled, the top two stand in terrific contrast on opposite ends of both her career and her sound. Apocalypsis is her follow-up to The Grime and the Glow, and while I said I wouldn't want cleaner production on that album, else it would sort of rob it of its edge, this album does feature a few songs from The Grime and the Glow that are basically reworked from the ground up and transformed to fit her sound on here. This time around we have a delightfully wicked blend of raw, grungy industrial instrumentation filtered through a gritty folk rock lens, and while far from being clean in a broader sense, this album is a notable step up from her debut. The reworked songs simply work better in this larger context, as Demons has far more propulsion with that wicked distorted guitar, and Moses is laden with gorgeous atmosphere throughout the runtime. I've said the word atmosphere a whole lot in this video, and nowhere better is it captured than on Apocalypsis. This album is positively drenched in rich soundplay and deep, dark, occasionally terrifying sounding production with loads of variety. It may not have the litany of genre influences that her other albums have, but this is early era Chelsea at her most maximal. From the chilling opening screeches of Primal Carnal, to the chilling, cult-like chant of Movie Screen, to the closer Through the Forest Towards the Sea, Apocalypsis lives up to its title. This is an album as desolate and empty and mean as something like Tom Waits' Bone Machine, but contains less humanity and more horror. The aforementioned closer sounding like a slumbering Lovecraftian monster rising from within the earth just to see its final death rattle. This album is eerie, haunted, and fatalistic in the most beautiful of ways. Every track is distinct, Chelsea is at her most utilitarian, and the overall feel of the album is just positively electric. There is genuinely nothing else like this out there, and that's one of the many reasons that I love it. Chelsea's upcoming collaboration with Converge isn't the first time that they've worked together, as 2017's His Spun marked what I would deem as the second biggest departure from a previous record's sound after Pain is Beauty, as Kurt Ballou of Converge is responsible for the recording here. And after one listen to any of these songs, it is abundantly clear as to why this team-up was such a terrific idea in the first place. While no stranger to heavy music and doom metal after Abyss, His Spun doubles down on the newer influences and commits to it entirely, as the industrial gothic doom metal sound here is basically all combined into Chelsea's most sonically focused project this side of Birth of Violence. That record coming after this one also explains a whole lot, both in terms of reception and charting her artistic trajectory. I completely understand having to scale back after exploring the heaviest possible facet of this particular sound, and I also kind of understand that fans probably found that scaling back to be so underwhelming, especially after such a phenomenal exercise in something so far removed from where she started. This is, without a doubt, one of the heaviest metal albums of the 2010s, as the slow, sludgy riffs aren't just mired in darkness, they are titanic in size. The opening stretch of songs here is maybe the highlight of the genre in like the past 10 years. It's an absolute assault of intricately mixed and textured guitar work that never feels like the blunt wall of sound that it could end up being. The more science fiction-y and horror elements of the lyricism and song titles are felt in the sound. There are occasional tinges of work that wouldn't be out of place on records like Abyss or Pain is Beauty. While I am utterly in love with this particular sound, both generally speaking and with how Chelsea specifically effortlessly executes it, this isn't even the primary reason I love this record. I mean, yeah, it's certainly a great deal of why, but personally speaking, I find the thematic content of this album to be some of its main draw. Both this album and Apocalypsis have thematic cores that feel as though they match the music that she works alongside flawlessly, in a way that other artists would only dream of doing. Apocalypsis was an album of death, waste, ruin, and loneliness, and His Spun here is an album of horror, mutilation, oppression, violence, and hate, which is probably why those are my two favorites. This is, in my opinion, an even darker record than something like Abyss or Pain is Beauty, both albums that wallow in heartbreak, abuse, and loneliness. This contains the whole package, but these tracks feel as though they weave together a portrait of terror that could only be achieved through this specific sonic lens. Harrowing stories inspired by real-life events and struggles of Chelsea's that can be found scattered throughout, most notably notably in the gnawing, grueling closer, the aptly titled Scrape, which details a story that was inspired by Chelsea's great-grandfather and the utterly sickening acts of sexual violence he enacted on members of her own family. Stories of subjugation and abuse are found all over this record, and how they change, mutate, and harm those who they affect. It is both personal and uncompromising, and yet again feels like diving into the heaviest sound Chelsea's played with was a decision that was born out of not artistic curiosity, but instead necessity. This is her at her most aching, pure, emotional, and resonant, and while I can't recommend that you start here, both because it's a very specific, exclusive sound to this album, and because the darkness may be too potent, it's something that I recommend you build to. It stands as a testament to her versatility, but never at the expense of her attention to detail. His Spun is a record that took time to properly grow on me and for me to properly understand it, but I find it to be a structural and narrative marvel. Even if you dislike her other work, I still recommend trying it just to build to and listen to this, as it's one of the most beautifully effective and constructed albums in this genre. It achieves a strange, near-liberating nirvana by soaking you in uncompromising darkness and finding a deeply unsettling form of peace and truth that is as satisfying as it is unflinching. But, yeah. That's gonna be it for this video. Tell me, if you're a fan, what are your thoughts on Chelsea Wolfe's work and her records? What's your favorite? Are you excited for Bloodmoon? If you are, stay tuned to the JMD podcast on this channel, where we will review new albums every single week, albums recommended by our hosts every week, and occasionally we do a retrospective on years or artists that we find significant. We'll be reviewing Bloodmoon when it drops, and naturally I'll be parsing through to see where it ranks in each artist's catalog. Till then.